when Nicolas and Christian and myself were writing the grant application, and this was the result of extensive collaboration and deliberation, traveling to different locations and talking with people in Louvain and Institut Syndical and Cardiff and Bristol and Paris Dauphine and lots of other places. You know who you are. And we talked a lot locally with all of the researchers to come up with a kind of project which we thought would make sense. Now, it's wildly ambitious, but I think the circumstances call for ambition because, frankly, another article in the British Journal of Industrial Relations or the Comparative Labor Law and Policy Journal is unlikely to effect the kinds of change that we hope to effect. So we came up with an idea, simply expressed, and it has to be saleable to a research council and multiple disciplines, and said, well, there are various lines of fracture taking place, fault lines we called them. I won't go down, but you saw that when we made the call for papers, we said, talk about how fault lines, a variety of descriptions, are affecting regulation, pushing towards re-regulation, deregulating, disrupting, etc. And I think we saw through the many sessions of this conference that you really stepped up and provided lots of examples, and we kind of said at one point, think of the way that these are happening in different institutional arenas, if you like, around the firm, around the market, around the state, around collective representation, around sectors and regions. It's just a way of organizing the conversation. So a lot of the workshops were organized in that way, having that kind of conversation, while obviously they're all interconnected. We also said that these fault lines and their effect are opening up the space for experimentation. Now, I think Glenn rightly pointed out in his different typologies that experimentation can often be quite bad. And if you go back several years, he talked about experimentation, Glenn, at our 2015 kind of preparatory conference, and it was clear in his mind at that point, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we've had 3.5 decades or 4 decades of neoliberal experimentation. Maybe it's time to have some other kinds of experimentation. So that was a starting point. And going from there, we said, well, if this experimentation is taking place, how do we understand it? And can we have us as laborists, as people who are interested in work and employment, though obviously we have to put this in a societal context, what kind of measuring stick can we have to understand what's taking place? And we borrowed here somewhat a lot from Dominique Méda, thinking about different dimensions of work. We borrowed the notion of better work from the ILO, but really, when you look at the ILO's practice of better work, it's enough to make you cry because it's quite narrow often, like, can you say something about health and safety in your workplace? It's a very low bar, and we said, let's put the bar higher. So let's talk about the allocation of social risk in all its dimensions. So what we mean by there is inequality, wages, your ability to plan your own life, and so on. And let's also talk about the control that you have over your working life. And we particularly borrowed on the work from Guylaine Vallée and colleagues here by saying, and Émilie Genin, if you can't manage the frontier between your work and non-work, or your work that's not paid, it's very difficult to have any degree of better work. And then the third dimension was aspirational, but well beyond, because we're really talking about expression, we're talking about voice, we're talking about citizenship. And we said we need, and we haven't worked enough on these criteria, and they can be better developed, but when we're doing these experiments of the re-regulation of work, we really want to see how it's impacting those different dimensions, because you might well give someone more control over their interface between work life and non-work life, But if it comes with vulnerability, poverty, and nothing to say, thank you very much, about what's happening in your working life, then that's not better work. And so you need a holistic way of looking at those together. And I think, again, through the conference and people looking at institutional experimentation in different arenas, is very interesting in this respect, but we need to push it further. Now, the idea of all of this background is then saying, well, if you've got this all set up, and you've got all this tremendous capacity in this research project, how do we then bring forward cases? So this is Glenn's locker. It's not my locker. It's the CRIMT locker. Yes, it's our collective locker of saying, how do we put together cases which will inform our thinking? How do we develop those cases? How do we compare them? How do we interrogate them? How do we learn from them? Because the objective over this period of time is to begin this dialogue in the co-construction of cases, to put cases together that can help us to learn. And I think we have a lot of sessions today, but you know, we're a small circle here, and the idea is to put, and it's an open process. So you don't have to be a CRIMTer to put a case into the data bank. We want it to be available to everyone, and that will then morph into an observatory, a virtual observatory. Now, there's a lot of learning that takes place like this, but the idea is that how do we take the research, which you're often doing anyway, and direct it towards some common goal? And how do we make that research have a bigger impact through this kind of process that we can say, we don't know whether it's going to work, but we can say over a longer period of time, this is going to have some significant impact. That's what we're trying to do, and that will lead to lots of conversations. And I think that if we learn from our past experience, it also inflects the way that people think about the research, so that they say, oh, that would be interesting because I can then push this in this direction. I can work with partners. I can do all kinds of things. And I see that as heading towards some goal.